Welcome back to CJ 213. This will be week two. We're going to be looking at chapters 2, 2, and 3. I'll start off with this lecture, chapter 2, which is sentencing and the correctional process. So let's begin with the key players here in the sentencing process. The first is the prosecutor. Prosecutors are either appointed or elected officials. Their responsibility is to bring the state's case against the accused, but it's not just about winning cases. Their ultimate obligation is to seek justice. That means convicting those who are guilty. Yes, but it also means ensuring that the process is fair. Prosecutors decide whether to file charges, what charges to pursue, and whether to offer a plea bargain. In practice, most cases don't even go to trial. The majority of them are resolved through plea deals, and prosecutors are basically the gatekeepers of that process. And from my 23 years working as a CO of Pontiac, I saw the long term effects of those decisions. I often talk with inmates who regretted rejecting a plea offer or others that felt they had no choice but to accept a deal. Their stories were always a reminder that prosecutors' discretion has lifelong consequences. So, actors in the sentencing process. Next, we have judges. Judges are senior officers in criminal court. Many are elected, and their duties are extensive. They must rule on evidence, motions, um, courtroom procedure. In bench trials, they even decide the guilt. But their most visible responsibility is sentencing. Judges balance the law, the facts of the case, and often their own judicial philosophy. I saw dramatic differences in sentencing outcomes. Two inmates could commit nearly identical crimes, but their sentences would be very different. Sometimes one got 5 years while the other received 20. So, what's the difference? It often came down to the judge's philosophy, the the jurisdiction's sentencing guidelines, and sometimes the defendant's resources. Judges are powerful decision makers, and their choices follow offenders for life. Now, another key group in sentencing process are the probation staff. Probation officers conduct what is called a pre-sentencing investigation, or PSI. This report provides the judge with background information about the defendant, family history, employment, criminal record, and more. The PSI helps the court decide on an appropriate sentence. Sometimes the recommendation is for probation. Sometimes it's for incarceration. Um, Pontiac, I met inmates who felt their PSI didn't tell the full story, but I also knew men who believed that their PSI saved them from harsher sentences. That's how important that this step is. Probation officers aren't just paper pushers; they can influence the entire trajectory of a case in most ways that people never see. So let's shift to bail. Bail is temporary. Conditional release of a person awaiting trial. It requires the accused to follow conditions such as staying within the jurisdiction, avoiding the victim, and not committing new crimes. The goal of bail is simple: to make sure defendants return for their trial. But here's the reality: bail often favors those with money. Those who can afford it get out, those who can't, they stay locked up. I saw many inmates who started their journey behind bars not because they were more dangerous, but simply because they couldn't pay the bail. That fact alone shaped the entire path through the justice system. So, pretrial release, it could take way different forms. Some people are released on their own recognizance, basically a promise to return. Others might pay unsecured bail or a percentage of that set amount. Some are placed under supervised release. These alternatives are meant to keep people out of jail before trial while still holding them accountable. But the truth is, many individuals still end up detained because they lack the financial resources. I knew guys that spent months in jail before their trial simply because they just couldn't post a few $100s. And by the time sentencing came, they've already lost their jobs, their apartments, sometimes their families. Pre-trial, pre-trial detention actually became a punishment in itself. So bail reform, try to fix these problems. The Manhattan Bail Project. It showed that many people could be safely released if they had strong community ties. Later, the Bail Reform Acts of 1966 1984 pushed for greater use of release while allowing detention for those considered dangerous. Even today, bail remains controversial. But here's something that I know from my experience. Many men inside the prison had nonviolent beginnings. If they'd been given more opportunities for a supervised release way early on, some may have never escalated to serious crimes. That's why bail reform matters. It's not just about fairness in pretrial release, it's about long term outcomes within the correctional system. So, imposing the sentence. Let's take a look at how sentences are imposed. Judges may issue concurrent sentences, which are served at the same time, or consecutive sentences, which are served one after the other. Good time credits also affect how long someone actually serves. In Illinois, good time often made the difference between years inside the prison versus a quicker release. These details, whether sentences run concurrently or consecutively, on how much good time is earned, it's so critical to how much time someone actually spends in prison. So, sentencing sanctions are they vary widely by jurisdiction. Judges can impose fines, probation, uh, intermediate sanctions, incarceration, or even the death penalty in some states. The judge, they have to weigh both the cost to society and the needs of the defendant. At BCC, I saw men who probably would have benefited more from um, intermediate sanctions or probation, but instead they served years in the maximum security facility. Sometimes incarceration felt like a one size fits all solution, even when it wasn't the best choice. So, one major model is indeterminate sentencing. So, this system sets a minimum and a maximum range. The parole board often decides when an inmate is ready for release. The idea is to tailor the sentence to the individual, but in practice, it often creates disparities. Two inmates can commit the same crime and serve very different amounts of time, depending on parole board decisions. I saw this all the time. Men served decades while others served similar crimes, went home much sooner. The inconsistency caused, obviously, a lot of frustration inside. I can't even imagine being in that position, knowing that I committed the same crime as this guy, but he got he got he got 5 years, I got 15. It just so there's a lot of unfairness that goes on there. So the other major model is determinate sentencing. Here, the offender serves a set amount of time, flat time, mandatory, or a presumptive sentence. In 1977, federal law moved heavily towards determinate sentencing. Today, many states have followed that. So this approach limits judicial discretion, but it also reduces uncertainty. So from the officer side, I'll say this: determinate sentencing made planning easier. We knew exactly how long someone would be inside, but it also removes some flexibility that could have helped with rehabilitation. Structured sentencing. This is these guidelines are another tool. These guidelines regulate sentence length, reduce judicial discretion. Minnesota, Washington, Pennsylvania, Florida were among the first to adopt presumptive guidelines. The federal government also uses these. The goal is consistency, making sure similar crimes receive similar punishments. But as we'll see, guidelines are not without controversy. Federal sentencing guidelines, they came out of Comprehensive Crime Control Act and the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984. They abolished federal parole and created the United States Sentencing Commission. Judges were required to justify any deviation from these guidelines. The intent was fairness and consistency, but the reality was often complexity and harshness. From my perspective, these guidelines were often meant that federal inmates were serving longer, more rigid sentences compared to state inmates. And once they were inside, they knew parole was just no longer an option. These guidelines have been challenged and adjusted over the years. In Blakely versus Washington in 2004 and United States versus Booker in 2005, the Supreme Court ruled that mandatory guidelines violated the Sixth Amendment. That shifted the guidelines from being mandatory to advisory. Even so, they continue to shape sentencing practices across the country, and to this day, they still remain controversial. One part of the guidelines that really shaped sentencing was mandatory minimums. These laws specifically, they specify a set number of years for certain offenses, especially drug crimes. Judges had little choice. I worked with men serving decades under mandatory minimum laws. Some were first-time offenders. Some were just caught up with relatively small amounts of drugs, but the law tied the judge's hands. Mandatory minimums filled prisons, but they didn't always make communities any safer. So another policy that had a major impact was the three strikes law. This required harsher sentences, often life in prison, after a third felony conviction. Three strikes. Here. Truth in sentencing laws also came into play, requiring offenders to serve a large portion of their sentence before becoming eligible for release. For federal grants, that meant at least 85% of the sentence had to be served. Truth in sentencing charged inmate behavior. I saw this. When men knew they had no chance of parole, hope just went out the window. And hopelessness inside of a maximum security prison is a very dangerous thing. So, how people are sentenced. A recent national study showed that 75% of felony convictions resulted in incarceration, compared to 56% of misdemeanor convictions. About 1 in 4 felony convictions resulted in probation. Murder cases carried the longest median sentences, which is 30 years. Rape averages 10 years. Robbery averages 5. But behind every statistic is a person. At PCC, those numbers were real faces. They were real lives, and those were real families waiting on the outside. So what happens after the sentence is served? 6 out of 10 prisoners, 62%, released are re-arrested within 3 years. 7 out of 10 within 5 years. Nearly half return to prison for a violation or any crime. I saw that cycle play out daily. Men would leave full of hope, and many came back, often for parole violations or new offenses. It is a sobering reminder that sentencing is not the end of the story. Reintegration is the real challenge. So American sentences are much longer than those in any nation. We are the only advanced nation that routinely incarcerates people for minor property crimes. When I compared stories from international corrections conferences, I realized just how punitive our system is. Some men were serving decades for crimes that that I knew at BCC that might have carried only just a few years somewhere else in the world. So, several legal factors influence sentencing: the severity of the offense, the defendant's prior record, whether a weapon was used, whether violence occurred, whether the crime was motivated by money. These are expected considerations, and they make sense, but it's not the whole picture. Non-legal factors also affect sentencing. Things like the defendant's social class, gender, age, even the victim's characteristics play, play a huge role. I met men who felt their sentence was harsher because of their background and because of who their victim was. Whether that perception is true or not, it influenced how they viewed the justice system, and perception matters. If people believe the system is unfair, they are less likely to respect it. Finally, we have to address racial disparities. Research often showed that black offenders often receive harsher sentences than white offenders, even when controlling for criminal history and offense seriousness. These disparities don't just appear at sentencing; they can emerge early in the process, during arrests, charging decisions, or even plea deals. What I saw at Pontiac was clear racial imbalance. The majority of men inside were minorities, and that raised tough questions about fairness, equity, justice. Sentencing is not just a legal process, it is a reflection of our society's values, and that's why understanding it is so critical. So, we've seen sentencing is complex. It involves multiple actors, from prosecutors to judges to probation staff. It includes bail decisions, sentencing models, guidelines, and policies like mandatory minimums. But sentencing is also personal. Behind every statistic, there's a life. And working 23 years in a max security prison, I'll never forget that. The decisions made in a courtroom just they send ripples out into communities, the families, and the institutions they're incarcerated in. They shape not just who goes to prison, but what happens when they leave. So, in our next chapter, we'll look at community corrections, diversion, probation, and the alternatives to incarceration that just continue to evolve in our justice system. All right. See you in the next lecture.